Thanks everyone for joining us today. Great to connect from a warmer part of the world, probably only for this week. I'm sure the second I leave, it will rain again. So this SATIB webinar is going to be dealing with all things adventure tourism, and I am your moderator today. My name is Natalia, for those of you who haven't met me. But why are we talking about adventure tourism? Well, beyond the fact that it generates billions for tourism destinations, for a country like South Africa, adventure tourism offers a strong growth opportunity, not least because of this excellent climate that we've got, the rich assets, and an already extensive array of adventure experiences on offer. So New Zealand, eat your heart out. Thankfully, I'm joined by a bunch of experts who are going to be talking about adventure tourism, not me, because I'm probably not the target market. I'm not that adventurous, believe it or not. So joining me, I've got Hannelie du Toit, who is the SATSA COO. We have another du Toit, I've realized. We've got two du Toits on the call today. Andre du Toit, who's the SATSA Adventure Chapter Chair. And
just to note, Natalia, yes. Sorry, no relation. This is not nepotism.
She's very quick to say that, Andre. I think you need to take that up after the call.
We need to have offline cuddle, I think.
And then our fellow Adventure Chapter Committee members, Marie-Louise Kellett and Mark Brown. So as always, you know the drill. The Q&A folder is at the bottom of the screen. The chat is open, so please feel free to ask any questions of our experts, our adventure tourism experts. And we are also recording the session, so we will be distributing through to SATSA members and anybody who registered to attend the webinar, the discussion that we're going to have today. So I think because we've got such a strong adventure chapter focus on this particular call, I'm going to start with Andre, just to give us a little bit of a background on SATSA's adventure chapter, some of the work that you've done and the goals. I mean, why do you even have an adventure chapter specifically focused on adventure tourism?
Yeah, Natalia, I think you touched on it yourself. It's just such an incredible booming industry globally, and I think we all know and believe that South Africa is perfectly positioned to take its rightful spot, and certainly one of the top adventure destinations around the world. And but realistically, we need to get our ducks in a row to do that. So, you know, it means making sure we position ourselves as a professional and credible community within the tourism sector. And the industry is very much run or dominated by small, medium-sized operators, largely small operators, actually, mom and pop shows or whatever the case might be. People are just passionate and they've gone out there and decided to start an operation. So it's remained largely unregulated or regulated by individuals themselves who know their business, know their operation, know their risk, and they've made a plan to establish some form of standard operating procedures and whatnot. But there are a lot of entrants to the market, and if we want to have something that is credible and top of its game, we obviously need to get the regulation process in place. So I know Hannelie is going to touch on the research that backs this process, but there's no doubt that we need to institute some form of self-regulation in South Africa, and we've got a gap, we've got a window before government imposes that legislation to do it ourselves. So the goal is to firmly position ourselves as a top adventure destination globally, that we've all agreed on. But you know what we've done to date in order to, and self-regulation is the primary short-term or immediate objective. We need to take things in small chunks because we've got limited resources. We've all got our own businesses to run, and we can only do so much. So self-regulation is the primary goal for now. We've established a committee. There are a few of us that aren't here, but they're all out of the industry, all of us, either as operators or service providers like ourselves from SATIB, from a risk management perspective. We've identified the initial activities that we believe are the low-hanging fruit, that we can have self-regulated with dare I say, a little less effort than others that are more complex. We've reached out to the industry, both on a platform like today and in communications through Tourism Update and SATSA that you've either seen or will see shortly, to invite people to either join SATSA and the adventure chapter, which is really primary goal, and we'd love that. We also understand that there's a lot of small operators out there, so we've introduced an adventure growth tier, which is also provides you certain member benefits, but it's more of a platform for us to introduce you to the SATSA environment, to the SATSA Adventure Chapter and what we're doing, and then work you up into a fully fledged SATSA Adventure Chapter member. So that's growth tier. Also comes at a nominal fee. And then we can't talk to people who we're not in touch with. So we have opened it up to the industry to say, just register. Register as an adventure operator, and you will be kept in touch with all of our movements. You will be, basically kept abreast of the self-regulation process. But in order to participate in that process, we ask that you be members of SATSA. So that's really what we've done. So there are going to be regular communications coming out. Once we've received those registrations and we've got that grouping, we're then going to reach out to all of you and ask you, to those of you who are members of SATSA or the growth sector, to volunteer your time to be a part of the working group. And we've established a few sectors that we're going to go for first. It's going to be the wheels-based operators, whether that's mountain biking or segways or whatever. There's going to be boat-based activities. There's going to be paddling on inland waters and SUPing. There's going to be mountaineering and hiking, and there's going to be aerial non-flight. Okay, those are the main activity centers that we're going to focus the working groups on so far. And the outcome of that is going to be establishing minimum operating criteria, which we will then communicate to all as absolute minimum standards. And then a little bit more of a deep dive into developing individual modalities and safety operational standards for each of those activities. And that's really the end goal. So piece of cake. We just need engagement from all of you out there.
So is there, having spoken anecdotally to people in the adventure tourism sector, is there widespread acknowledgement that there needs to be some level of self-regulation? Because, when you hear the word regulation, you already think, oh, I don't know if I want to go down this rabbit hole. What kind of, what's the response been, Andre?
I think it's been fantastic so far. We need a broader community to be involved, but I think everybody realizes we've sadly had enough incidents in the industry to highlight the fact that self-regulation is absolutely necessary. And trust me, we see them on the insurance side and the incident management side. So there's definitely that acknowledgement. There are those businesses that are more mature, that like Marie-Louise's and Mark's and many others out there, who are also understandably probably a little concerned about sort of new entrants to the market that don't have the experience, but there's definitely a willingness to collaborate and share, IP and standards to make sure that everybody gets onto the same path. But rather, let's do that than have onerous legislation placed on us by government.
Yeah, and before I move over to Hannelie to take us through kind of what that roadmap is, it's not just about making sure that all the due diligences are in place and that one needs to self-regulate because you don't want there to be an issue, like you don't want government to regulate you, but you can't underestimate the extent to which self-regulation is important from a destination reputation perspective, and the fact that you are holding in trust the safety of your guests that are coming to South Africa. So for me, that is a very important piece, in addition to not wanting government to regulate us, essentially. Would you agree?
Yeah, there's a duty of care. I mean, and we're in hospitality at the end of the day, aren't we? So there's absolutely that duty of care. And what affects an incident that affects an individual or an isolated company affects brand tourism, brand South Africa at the end of the day. So it's critical we actually all get on board.
Okay, let's move over to Hannelie, who's always so good at getting into the weeds and the detail. I must say that's something I admire deeply because I'm not like that. And so take us through that roadmap. How do we get there, essentially?
Okay, well, I'm going to step back a little bit because of my detail to just sort of like, why are we sitting here today? So Johan Radcliffe, and I think he's online. How's it, Johan? You've been a sort of a, what do you call it, proponent. I don't know. My English is so bad sometimes. When I need it, it fails me. A forerunner in making sure that all of this is happening. I mean, for years we've had conversations about adventure tourism, but your words are, adventure tourism is the sleeping giant in South Africa, and it truly is. It is a giant. Worldwide, it has been proven that adventure tourism is the fastest growing subsector, literally since 2010, and that growth is set to rocket. You know, Natalia found us some research with Allied Market Research that estimates that the tourism adventure sector will be worth 1.2 trillion, close to 1.2 trillion by 2018. And that's a compound annual growth rate of 20%. That's massive. That's coming out of a pandemic. This is the sort of kind of thing that you need to get us going again. So of course, our objective is to cash in on this potential for South Africa. That's really what we've been needing to do for a long time. And Natalia, like you said, we've got so many activities, natural beauty, we've got excellent climate. You know, these are the things that people choose adventure tourism destinations for. I'm going to come a little bit later into some of the international research that I did, like with New Zealand. I mean, they are the adventure capital of the world, and they take their entire marketing strategy and focuses on adventure. But we have maybe not every single activity they have. They have a few glaciers and snow, which we might not have, but we have an amazing amount of activities, and you know, it's there. So to drive this post-pandemic economic recovery, adventure tourism really can aid with that. It can also aid with a lot of things like rural development, transformation. There's a lot of things that it can play, so we have to wake this giant up. Now, how do we do that? As Andre said, by positioning South Africa as the destination of choice for adventure tourism. We want people to come here, not just like literally plan an entire trip to South Africa, like an adventure itinerary almost. Now, how do we do that? How do we position ourselves? Is we build credibility around safety management, and we profile this reliable and fun adventure industry. How do we do that? We need a database of credible products in order to do that, and that we get through this sort of Bill Harrop is also the other person that I do have to mention here, because there's just so many roads walked there. He was the one that coined these words, like an evidence-led process, so we talk about regulation, but it's really an evidence-led process to prove safety and credibility. And as you say, we have the potential for government regulation, or we can do self-regulation. I'm going to touch on that just now. But sort of through some of the research, we know this. Most countries are prioritizing adventure tourism. They're all busy doing this in any case. And they're doing it because it is resilient to natural and political setbacks. Adventure tourism tourists are a little bit like all of us in the room, slightly loony, except Natalia. As you said, this is not your target market, but or you are not the target market. But you know, a strike or a riot or something like that, it's not necessarily something that would chase them away as easily. It's high value customers, it support local economies. I mean, there's just so many benefits that we can talk about, but they're doing this regulation for one of two reasons. And it's either because they see the economic potential, or because of reputational damages from accidents that has happened. So, for example, New Zealand, Malaysia, and England have developed government regulations. So New Zealand was first self-regulation, then they went over to government regulation, and India, Kenya, and Brazil has got a pure sort of self-regulation process. Now, the reason for that is quite often self-regulation is a higher standard that you would get from a government regulation, but you know, we know that private sector is much more agile when we do projects, etc. So the Department of Tourism started talking about adventure tourism in 2013, and they did a document, a research document, and basically said that regulation is required, but they would do it by providing sort of dedicated. It needs dedicated financial and human resources in order for this to be set up. It's complex, the adventure tourism industry. It is a time-consuming effort, and it needs expert knowledge. You know, you can't take a tour operator and ask him to do top rope instruction for adventure tourism or set standards for that. So they identified in there then that it needs to be a self-regulation, that it needs to be industry regulated, and that SATSA at that stage was the vehicle for them to do this through, because of the due diligence work that we already do in the tourism industry. So yeah, the lots of consultation happened. I'm sure most of you guys were in that. It was a very frustrating process because we submitted the proposal in April 2015. They said, great, they're going to budget it in their 2016-17 financial period. Then they sort of just didn't budget it. We had the then was Minister van Schalkwyk, and he basically instructed them to budget the money and to start identifying interim funding for us to do a little bit of the initial research, which is what we did. So we submitted again a proposal again afterwards, and in 2017 department came back and said that because of the legal risk to them, because if they are now the department that says these guys are quality approved, or they can be linked to that, when an accident happens they would be the person sued, because people, you know, when you take a case to court, it's always the person with the most money is the one that gets sued. Anyway, so that was fine. I mean, we sort of then went through to the SA Tourism and eventually Tourism Business Council through their Tourism Collaborative Fund. That was in 2018. They approved it. They said, in principle, done. We are going to go ahead with the adventure tourism. So part of this is also just me explaining to you guys why it's taken so incredibly long to get here. So yeah, approved. We're going to start, they need to sort out their corporate governance, and we need to submit a business plan, which we then eventually did in October 2019 only, because it took August 2019. It took a while for them to get the corporate governance sorted out. And actually to today, we've never had feedback. It's just something that sort of disappeared. But that's fine, because that's where we are now. The adventure tourism chapter, so August 2019, we sent our last proposal. We haven't had feedback. And in 2020, we started the adventure tourism chapter in SATSA. And that is literally basically saying that us as private sector we have the knowledge, we have the expertise. If we all do it on a voluntary basis, as Andre said, this big collaborative, multifaceted industry that comes together and decide what we can do. It is possible. And even if it is just us making a start and eventually we get some other people along the road, that would be great. But just very quickly, and I don't know how many of you might have heard this before, but out of the research that this interim funding did, we did a market mapping of South Africa, and literally what we could find from a desktop research was 2,317 individual activities taking place across South Africa. That's a lot, 2,300. Look, we don't know post-pandemic what that would look like, but that's certainly the point that we can go back to. We sort of categorize that it's so difficult, you know, even just identifying what is essentially adventure tourism, because sometimes you know, the ATA, the Adventure Trade and Association, even a cultural activity for them is an adventure tourism, because it takes people out of the, you know, out of their normal day-to-day thing. We've had a lot of conversations as SATSA as well about how we do that, and I think part of the consultation that we're going into as the adventure chapter that Andre was speaking about, we will touch on that again, clearly defining it. But yeah, so we sort of just loosely categorize that into 29 subsectors. So at the end of the day, the important amount here is that there's 147 different kinds of adventure activities in South Africa. That's everything from sliding around like bakkie, sleighing after, you know, behind a bakkie, or climbing through tunnels in Cape Town, or, you know, all of the others. Really, really wide. And that's why I say, compared to New Zealand, who is our main competitor in this space, we really do have so much that we can work with. So yeah, that's sort of in a nutshell where we are. It is this voluntary, and that's going to be very important. What we're doing is always going to be a voluntary process. It's never going to be a requirement. If you are a SATSA member, or if you want to have that kind of credibility, It's a voluntary, it's dynamic, it's going to change as we grow. And it's this sort of self-accreditation, self-regulation process that we're going to take forward.
147, that is astounding.
Yeah.
That is astounding. But then, you know, you talk about the self-regulation and how the industry can get involved. You actually need to have a very widespread amount of voices for you to be able to put that self-regulation together, because what suits the one subsector that will not suit the other subsector. So how are you going to make sure that you have that kind of broad coverage across all of the different types of adventure travel, because it's so diverse?
Yeah, so look, Andre touched on it a little bit in the fact that we've got different task teams. So in this project that we've got the chapter committee, and then we have working groups, which is, we've sort of loosely based it, like Andre said, aerial, non-flight, boating, and I don't remember all of the rest out of the top of my head now, but and then we have task teams, which will look like at things like training, guide accreditation, etc. What we're asking industry to do is to register with us, and we will put them into that categorization that we've got. And when we start talking about boating, all the boat operators would go there. If we're talking about a bungee or zip lining, you know, we will, and this is the lovely thing. It's not a SATSA thing. It really, this is an industry. So we really are trying to make it big. But we're also asking for associations, legal experts, anybody that has anything to do with the adventure industry or can add value to actually come on board and help us to define this.
So I'm unusually going to throw it out to the attendees. I'd love to see in the chat what you guys think about, firstly, the formation of a SATSA adventure chapter, and secondly, around the self-regulation aspect. We have received quite a few questions, and I'll go through them as well. If you do have a question, please feel free to put that in the Q&A folder or in the chat. I'm going to hop over to Marie-Louise, because there is a question that Nick has posed around SNS ISO 21101 and 21102, not sure if I've said that correctly, which are now requirement standards. Can SATSA help small organizations with conformity? And I'm particularly, I know Han's got her hand up, but I'm particularly interested in is that regulation versus standards. So I don't know who wants to speak to that first.
So I'm actually going to back that straight back at Hannelie, because she's actually on that committee and she's got a much better handle on how the ISO standards work in practice. What I can say is that I haven't looked through them in huge detail, but generally speaking, they're well put together and can be very useful. But Hannelie can give you a much better informed answer. Okay, over to you, Han.
So we are literally going to absorb those standards into what we're doing. So so we serve on the SABS TC 228, which is the tourism committee, and they have different working groups, and working group, gosh, 7 is adventure tourism. I have attended through all of the research and stuff that I've done. I've attended a few sessions, the plenary in Malaysia, for instance. And as the sort of mirrors committee in South Africa, we have adopted all of the work that the adventure working group has done. They've done some really amazing stuff. So it is an international standard. It has been adopted as a local standard, but currently under SABS, there's nobody that can verify that you've actually followed this process and give you a certificate. So for us, incorporating that into the work that we're doing, how do you brief clients? How do you brief guides? There's quite a few that has been adopted. So that'll just simply form part of what we're doing. Now, and standards is, and it's also a voluntary thing. It's like anything else with SABS, the ISO stuff. It is a voluntary process. So we probably will go into a lot more detail. So when it comes to boating, it'll be around, what are your specific safety operations under a boating operation, whereas the ISO standards are quite broad.
All right, well, let's move over to Mark and talk about regulation in action. So it's all great. We're talking about this very theoretically. Mark, can you give us an idea of what that actually looks like in practice?
Thanks, Natalie. Well, I can speak from an industry point of view, and several years ago, we all identified the fact that there were a lot of accidents happening. Insurers were starting to ask questions, and foreign was starting to by. So we got together as a group of industry players. There were approximately eight of us, and we engaged the government, the Department of Labour, and we asked them to help us with developing standards and where they fit into sort of government policy. And surprisingly, they were pretty helpful. And standards and regulations, and we asked the government where they would fit in. And it turned out that there was a place for them to fit in with the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So the process, unbelievably, Natalia, took 8 years to go through. Required a lot of patience, required a lot of, but we pushed through, and our aim as an industry was to keep those standards as simple as possible. We didn't want to do anything complicated that would be very difficult for people to abide by. We didn't want to make them too long be interested in joining up, and we didn't obviously want to make them too onerous. So, I mean, I'll give you a small example. We fit in with the same regulations as, you know, a lift in a building, because it's cables. And lifts in building have to be tested very regularly, and they're very easy to test. But if you came to me and asked us to test a zip line across a mountain valley with a load test every month, it's a very difficult process to get those weights into the gorge, to test them, to calibrate them. So we had to, it was a bit of with the Department of Labour into what would be acceptable, what would keep it safe, and what would be acceptable from a national safety point of view. So, yeah, happy that in Christmas 2020, the regulations were promulgated, they were gazetted, and they are now officially law in South Africa, that zipline operators have a very simple set, or I don't know if, sorry, my internet connection is unstable. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got you.
Sorry, that's, I've got a little unstable notice there. Yeah, so we kept the regulations really simple. We had a big workshop we had about 30 inspectors come to one of our businesses, and none of these guys had seen a zip line before. None of them wanted to get into a harness, and we realized that it was going to be quite challenging to kind of walk the department through regulating an industry like zip lines. So I just want to wish all the shark cage diving guys and the rafting guys lots of luck getting inspectors done, because we have been there. Yeah, so back to the story. The government published the Gazette. We managed to get a really nice exclusion for existing businesses. So we got them to agree that everyone who was existing, it would be a very simple process. You just needed an engineering letter, bit of information about the company, confirmation that you abided by these norms and standards, and these businesses got registered. And I'm really happy to say, I checked yesterday, there are just over 50 zipline businesses now registered officially with the government. And that's entirely driven by us, you know, a small group of zipline and rope adventure park operators. These guys are all legal now. They've all got standards to abide by. Insurance companies know that these guys now are properly registered. The foreign tour operators, we get questions about what regulations are there in your country, what are you doing? And we can now tick a box and say that there are regulations, we do abide by them. I can tell you it's making a bit. So the downside the small downside is that I recently tried to register a new business a couple of months ago, and we sent the letter through, and we received easy anymore. So now, because these are new businesses, now we have to include engineering calculations and a set of drawings. So it's not a lot more, but it's a little bit more. So it's really, so yeah, the other nice thing I can tell everyone about it is it's really brought our little sub-industry together. People who were previously competitors, we didn't know who was doing what. Everyone now is in the same room, on the same page. We're talking to each other more. It's really helped our industry. So yeah, it's been good all around. I don't really have any complaints about it at the moment. I think it's going to keep growing. I think it's great there's so many people on board. And yeah, we'd be happy to share things that we've learned in the process. It has taken a long time, but we are there now. So we did it, and thanks to the guys at the Department of Labour. They really were, yeah, they were helpful.
Mark, so those standards, are they they've been gazetted, so they're kind of fixed in stone, but do you see those evolving as your sector evolves, or is it like that's it, you're not going to have to reevaluate or redesign anything going forward?
That's a great question. Yes, without a doubt, these standards were designed as a small entry level introduction, get everyone. We have formed a local association called ARCA, the African Ropes Course Association, and together as an industry, we will slowly update these and improve them over time. I mean, to give you an idea, our standards are about 3 or 4 pages long. The international standards are about 23 or 24 pages long. So we don't want to get to 23 or 20. We will slowly tweak and improve them, you know, as the situation demands and as, you know, as the industry develops. But for the time being, they are suitable, they're working, and improve them over time, slowly.
One of the elements you mentioned, Mark, and I've also seen quite a bit of it in the chat, certainly is around this idea of liability insurance and how difficult it is actually for you to get liability insurance if you don't have those standards. Andre, do you want to just touch on that for a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I see a couple of questions coming up around aviation and quad biking and whatnot in the slot. But yeah, I mean, underwriters need to make sure that operating standards are in place. No underwriter in their right mind is going to put their premium pool at risk for the sake of a few sort of loose cannons, if I can call it that. So it's super important. And the first thing we get, you will not, in the adventure industry, insurers are already on edge as soon as you mention adventure industry. So it's absolutely imperative. They won't even look at an operation unless you have operating procedures in place. Could be your own, depending on the industry, but you have to comply with the law of the land. You certainly have to comply with what's considered best practice in your particular sector, if law doesn't exist or regulation doesn't exist. And at the very least, where best practice doesn't exist, you've got to create it. So if we can provide that, and Mark's a great example. We've been insuring Canopy Tours for many, many years, and we've been through some tough times with them. But you know, now if we have a zipline operator that comes through to us, I'll give Mark a quick ring, and if they are aligned with ARCA and they've had that standard introduced to the operation, insurers are willing to take it on, and that's considered a pretty high risk in the adventure sector. And then just quickly to touch on the aviation question, aviation liability will sit with the owner of the aircraft. So as an operator who's using an aircraft as a subcontractor, you can't provide your clients with passenger liability, because the liability, remember, responds when there's negligence on the part of the owner or pilot. So you can't buy that as an operator. And in the event of a quad bike liability, if it's a self-drive, there's no reason you can't have liability. So unless you're actually escorting someone, have them on the back of your quad bike, and you are physically driving guests around, you can then get passenger liability for quad bikes. You just need to be chatting to the right people. But if it's self-drive, then a liability question falls away completely.
Marie-Louise, sorry. So Marie-Louise has been furiously responding to questions that are in the Q&A folder, but I'm going to bring her back and go back to that point around standards and regulations, because when Mark was talking, he was talking about both standards and regulations. And I think it's important that we get the language right, first of all. So what is the right terminology, number one? And number two, what are the pros and cons of a regulation versus standards? I'm not clear like what the difference is, Marie-Louise, so please enlighten me.
Okay, so standards are basically, a standard is something, a kind of a measurable performance level that you can compare your operation against. So that's, it's essentially probably going to be a checklist or some kind of simple document where you can establish whether you're meeting the recognized standards. Now, there are two types of standards. The one is an industry standard, and the other one is a government imposed standard. I'm sure there are other types, but in my mind, those are the two main types. An industry standard is something where the members of that industry have gotten together, much like Mark described, and sat down around a table and decided what they considered to be the minimum requirements for safely operating whatever discipline they do. So that's your industry standard. Then you may have government coming along and imposing a standard which in an ideal world is exactly the same as the industry standard, but sometimes isn't. An example of a government imposed standard is obviously your driving license. They decide. And they've decided, my daughter did her learners the other day, you have to get, I forget what, but it's a really high mark to pass, no 30% pass marks when it comes to your learner's license. So government has decided there, and we have no say in it. So that's the basic difference between, or the two types of standards. Then you've got regulation, and the regulation is how do you enforce those standards. So it can be completely 100% voluntary, and there's no, there's no regulation of those standards at all. And in some cases, there's varying levels of regulation. And we'll start this time from the top. So your most sort of not onerous, but the top of the heap is if government is imposing or is regulating those standards. Or on the other end of the scale, it can be self-regulated. So that's where the industry regulates itself. And in between those two extremes, you've got sort of combinations thereof. So for example, in the paddling industry, or anything to do with boating, actually, SATSA is the government, they are a government body, but they're not a government department. They're a government recognized body, and they're responsible for regulating everything that happens on the water, from cruise ships to container ships to a two-man inflatable croc on the Orange River. And they've got their own mechanisms for sort of regulating. So it's quite a broad, there's quite a broad spectrum in that whole sort of category. Like Mark was saying, they were working with the Department of Labor. They haven't worked with the Department of Tourism at all, even though it is a tourist product. So there's quite a broad scope there in terms of the regulation of the standard. So probably in an ideal world, you'd want a little bit of both. So again, if I use paddling as an example, SATSA has the power to literally close down an operation if they're not complying with the regulations. And you do need something with a bit of teeth, because the problem with self-regulation is it has no teeth. So someone can just go, oh, well, sorry, I don't feel like complying, and do their own thing, and there's actually nothing you can do to stop them. So you want a little bit of teeth somewhere in your kind of recipe of regulation and standards. So yeah, I hope that helps a bit.
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
Can I add quickly, Natalia?
Yeah, go for it.
Just to scare everybody properly, can I just say MPTR? Because that's a government regulation thing. And exactly. I mean, we had a huge conference this morning, press conference, around the inefficiencies of the MPTR. That's the risk that we have if we sort of allow or wait until government starts regulating us.
That's reason enough to start yesterday. Okay. All right, let's take some of the questions that have come through. And one of the questions, if you hadn't seen in the chat, was Andre was talking about registering. Where are you able to register? There is a link in the chat, and I'm going to paste it again. where you can register your business. Remember, you do not need to be a SATSA member to register your business. It's basically just getting an understanding of who's who in the zoo, essentially. So that is in the chat, and we'll also make sure that we have, we'll send that out with the recording as well. So Peter
Natalia,
has,
can I just interrupt you there again? I'm
Sure.
so sorry about this.
No problem.
I've asked Jeanette from your office to do a little temporary page for us that has the differences between stakeholders, businesses, growth members. So I've pasted that link. I'll paste it again. It might be easier for those who are not operators, but want to be part of the process. Thanks.
No worries. Okay, so William Ali Teaton said, independent schools who run adventure programs in-house become a member of SATSA, yes, or unrelated? Always become a SATSA member. That's the short answer. Hun? You're on mute.
I'm passing the ball to Andre.
Sorry, what the activity category?
Yeah. It's
What
a
were they?
school team building, a school adventure program.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, recent circumstances has made it very tricky to ensure because of the multitude of activities that typically take place. You're not specializing in one particular activity, but yes, we are working on them, and I completely see you as part of the sector of delivering adventure activities. Strictly not tourism, I suppose, but I think it's part of the wider community, and we should embrace that and see what we can do together.
And there's also the South African Adventure Industry Association, which does a lot of work on the school camps. I want to say team building stuff. I know Jessie is online. Hi, Jessie. We haven't met yet, but hi. So yeah. Thanks.
Yeah,
they can. I think it's important to just form part of the process for now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would you put your contact details, if you are happy to, in the chat, so that he has access to that quite easily? I'd appreciate that.
Yeah.
A nice question from Peter. So he's qualified as a cultural guide. Do I need to have any qualification for becoming an adventure guide? So are there any kind of standards that are associated with the actual adventure guiding aspect? Marie-Louise, do you want to talk to that?
I've got to laugh. It's going to take a while.
That is not a nice question.
Sorry. Well, you've got to answer it, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and that's actually that's the next thing that I was supposed to talk about anyway. So yeah, we have a situation in South Africa where tourist guides are by law required to register with their provincial tourist guide registrar. In order to do that, they have to have completed a CAT-CETA or they have to an NQF assessment. I apologize for all of the acronyms for those who aren't familiar with them, and I'm sure that together with Hannelie, we will also put an explainer about this whole process onto the resource page. And within that, there are 3 categories of tourist guide. There's an adventure guide, a culture guide, and a nature guide. The nature guides are generally your guys that work on safari vehicles and doing walking safaris and the whole kind of safari side of things. The culture guides are, let's start with adventure guides. The adventure guides are people leading adventure activities, and the culture guides are pretty much everything else. And within the culture guide sort of side, there's a whole multitude of different types of qualification you can get. And I don't know too much about the nature guide side, but I think it's quite a lot simpler. And then in the adventure guide side, we have a qualification which is called the generic adventure site guide qualification. And theoretically, if you are a culture guide and you want to now add an adventure activity of some kind, you actually have to start from scratch and redo your guiding qualification from scratch. On top of that, the GASG, it's a good qualification for somebody who is going to be self-employed, running their own little business. You know, it covers a lot of stuff, but it is way, way, way too complicated, too expensive, too long, too everything for the average adventure guide just kind of starting out or one who works for somebody else. So there is a huge problem and challenge around adventure guide qualifications. And there is a little bit of hope on the horizon, because there's a new process that's just started where the tourist guide the whole qualification is going to be redesigned. And that may give us an opportunity to redesign something that is much more sort of fit for purpose. But now, put all of that aside, because that's the government's requirements, and look to industry. What does industry require of you? So depending on what kind of discipline you want to get involved with, what kind of activity you want to do, there are already some standards in place. So for paddling, it's quite well established. For mountain climbing, it's well established. For hiking, it's well established. So depending on what you want to do, there are courses you can do. There are certificates you can get. Some of them are international, some of them are local. So it depends a lot on what you want to do. But the quick answer is yes, you will have to do something in addition to your basic culture guide qualifications.
That's great. At least there's a little bit of hope. Sure. When you started telling me that you're going to start everything from scratch, I started having nightmares. Anyway, okay, back to our questions. If you have a question, please feel free to throw that in the Q&A folder for me, or you can throw it into the chat. Evelyn has said, we are in the boating industry and are currently facing down some detrimental changes within SAMSA, who are trying to amend regulations for vessels going to sea. Vessels rated as passenger vehicles. Wow, any vessel exceeding 12 passengers. They are trying to limit the amount of fuel a vessel may carry. Currently, it is 50 litres per engine, so that is 100 litres for a vessel with 2 engines. The prospect is that a limitation of a total of 50 litres of fuel to now be 25 litres on board is going to be a disaster for whale watching and shark cage diving boats. An average trip takes 2 hours, and a big boat has 30 engines. Oh. 300 horsepower engine needs around 25 to 30 litres to run for that time. It is totally irresponsible to go to sea without sufficient fuel. The only reason they are doing this is because there was apparently a boat that caught fire at sea, so they want to limit the fuel for what seems like one incident. Wow, it appears that we as operators will have to take this on legally. Han, is that something that Andre, that the adventure chapter would do a bit of lobbying around?
Best for Han to answer that. I think SATSA, yes, lobbies on behalf of operators around South Africa. So just like the NTPR, if it's getting in the way of us running good business, then absolutely, if it's unreasonable, which it seems to be.
Yeah, the only pity about lobbying is, in my 7 years at SATSA, I've learned that it takes a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, even as Mark said, 8 years to try and to get their sort of stuff registered. So MPTR, we are now on 6 years. So definitely we'll raise our voices and help. Evelyn is actually going to be leading the working group on boating for us.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely.
And all the more reason to get the self-regulation process really going. And I think we're getting there now. We're building momentum, and I see a lot of volunteer services coming through in the chat box, which is wonderful. But we really aren't stopping here, guys. So if you want to be a part of this process, it really is register. Let's get this ball rolling, because the quicker we can get our own self-regulations in place, as simple as they might be, just as a start, it's a lot easier to establish them than it is to try and erode what is passed down from government and re-establish our own set.
Yeah, and importantly, I'll get to one of the questions that Hannelie actually did answer in the chat. You do not need to be a SATSA member to be involved in this. So, no one's forcing you to become a SATSA member. What we're saying is that we want this industry to be self-regulated. One, because we don't want government to regulate us. We've seen this movie, NPTR, has been a nightmare. And two, because it is the right thing to do to position Destination South Africa as a destination that takes adventure tourism seriously, essentially. So the point that Alan, or at least the question that Alan asked that Hannelie kindly answered, was, can one join as an individual? So instead of joining as a company, can you actually participate as an individual? Can you register as an individual? And the answer to that is yes. At least that's what I saw in the chat. Correct? Yes, Andre's nodding, so that's all good.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's see what else we've got here. Right. Are there any standards for sand sledding? Woo,
No,
that's
established.
exciting.
Send us your
Yes.
SOPs. We'll
Yes.
yeah.
That's you. You can be in charge of the sand sledding subcommittee.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Okay, what else have we got here? All right, let's see, Peter. How do you get more involved with adventure? I'm a mountain biker, so would be able to offer my services maybe as a volunteer. I think you've probably responded to that already, Andre, in the chat, so we're all good. I'm a qualified 4x4 and overlanding adventure guide, overnight camping. I will gladly assist when you address this part of it, the adventure tourism. Thank you very much.
Great.
Great, I can see there's lots of volunteers here. This is absolutely wonderful, wonderful. Let's see, any other questions? I think let's go on to the next steps. Yeah, so the way forward. This has been wonderful. I'm going to hold you all to account. What are the next steps, Andre? What's going to happen?
Well, I think first and foremost, and maybe a little bit of repetition, but get registered. We can't be engaged if we don't have your contact details. Promise you, Poppy, Act and whatever, it'll be safe. We won't spam you with anything else. This is a very focused project, but we need your assistance. And it's just so chuffed to see all the hands getting put up in the corner there. So that's step one. Absolutely. Very swiftly after that, we will be communicating a clearer action plan. But as we said, it's going to involve, we've already set up task groups, well, leader groups for wheels, boat-based, paddling, mountaineering, hiking, and aerial non-flight, because we believe they represent good clusters of activities, and they do already have good examples of best practice. So there'll be working groups set up around each of those. Those working groups will establish the minimum criteria for operating that are not onerous, that we can get out there and just not to have them registered or legal, but just to essentially stabilize the industry and have something for people, something simple for people to aim at. And then obviously a deeper dive into the individual modalities, safety, operational standards for each of the activities therein in those sectors. And that will result then in a process whereby it gets presented for sort of draft approval. Hannelie and Mark will know the process more clearly, but when it starts to get more official, more formal, and then obviously into a gazetted stage. But that's a long way off. I think right now, focusing on what we can achieve and what we honestly believe we can achieve before the summer season comes along is to get those established minimum standards for key operational clusters. That is really what we want to aim for now.
Do you have a timeline?
Some of them would be, so we've got, as Nick's pointed out very, very clearly, there are already standards in place for a lot of activities. The other thing we're going to be doing on the SATSA website is to make sure that all of those are made available for public view. So if you are in a certain, that'll be categorized accordingly. So if you are sandboarding and there happens to be a standard around that, or hiking, as Nick pointed out, that will be the first go-to, and that standard will be on the website. We will then have a SATSA version that speaks to that, but simplifies it for the operator in the street.
Okay, so question from Mark, what is aerial non-flight? Does Mark want to answer that?
Use the wings.
It is things like canopy, zip line, bungee jump. It's anything that sort of happens not on the ground, in the air. Mark, maybe you can elaborate on that. But Mark Bellingham, hi. I will put, when you do the registration, we have a list of all of the different subcategories. So there's a lot. It's going to irritate people when they have to look for their own, but it gives a reasonable explanation.
Cool. Okay.
I think a good summary is if you don't have wings on and you're flying through the air on a big swing or a zip line or a rope adventure park or a bungee jump, yeah, you're up in the air, but you don't have wings.
Red Bull gives you wings, Mark. Red Bull gives you wings. Okay. Right, I think I'll take one last question before we'll knock off for the day, and that's Evelyn, can we make a list of accredited legal and reputable guide training facilities available countrywide? So many have closed down in recent years, and it would be helpful to know who is in our respective areas. Han.
Okay, absolutely, yes. Part of the value add, I think, that will come of being part of the Adventure Project is going to be things like good service providers, but also keeping a track of accidents, incidents, because for Andre and them, it's very important to have that kind of information to make a good case for, reduced insurance fees. Trends in the industry, all of those sort of things are going to be, added as value add to the Adventure Chapter.
Great. I think on that note, I'd like to thank our panelists today for sharing their knowledge so generously. I look forward to seeing the results of all of that hard work. And I'm heartened by the extent to which we received offers of volunteering and help. And so, the adventure tourism sector is a tight sector. So this is something that we can do together. And as we said, when we started this, we do not need to wait for government to do this for us. It is in our hands. So let's go forth and conquer and position Destination South Africa as the leading adventure tourism destination it should be. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you on a SATIB webinar again soon. Cheers everyone.